Thank you, Lorena. I think it's important to distinguish between these two concepts of secularization and democratization. When I say we have been secularized, it doesn't mean we have been democratized. When I say that even political parties across the political spectrum, they have their rhetoric and discourses change into a secular rhetoric, it doesn't mean that we have become more democratized. However we define it, it can be completely separate. There is one element, actually, the person of Imam, as I said, this element contributes to democratization, at least in terms of social imaginary. So as I said, when you have these regular elections, so it always intensifies, reinforces the idea that, okay, the central pillar of, legitimacy is people. And it just makes it more and more salient, feature of the political system and social imaginaries of people. But then it doesn't necessarily make it democratic. So as in the Middle East, at least in the last, probably in 20th century, most regimes have been secular, but they were not democratic. So even before the revolution in Iran, the regime was secular in a kind, the Shah regime, but it wasn't secular. Assad regime is secular but not democratic. So all of them, there is no very direct, say, relationship between these two. Well, let's get back to the democratic aspect of this, upcoming elections. Then what's happened is that the regime has, very progressively restricting, narrowing down the access to electoral arena for political parties. So, for example, in 1997, reformists, they have access to, they could participate in elections quite freely. Not quite freely, but much better than now. Then it's, has step by step been restricted. So in 2012, we had this, I guess, Hashemi Rafsanjani was disqualified, he wasn't even a reformist. He was a moderate kind of, he was conservative earlier, then he became kind of moderate. Then in 2017, you had disqualified, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. So you have, this trend of, making it more strict and strict. And of course, it does affect participation. And, as you know, and you've mentioned, the participation rate is predicted to be probably historical low after the revolution. So I will go through again about some of the aspects of elections and why and how it does. And probably let me explain right now. Look, elections in Iran, and perhaps you may ask, why basically do we have elections? Because as you know, there are quite, different constitutional bodies that they impose some restrictions on who they could, run for presidency, for the parliament and other, elected offices. But then you restrict it. So what's the point? Why basically you do have elections, and what are the gains of elections for you? First of all, after 40 years, it's difficult to change the constitution and say we don't want elections. So it's not so possible. It was there. It's kind of path dependency. Okay, it's not easy just to say from one day it's not a viable option. But even if you could, elections provide lots of benefits for the regime. And it's not just Iran. So all electoral authoritarian countries. So those countries that basically they are authoritarian, but they use electoral forms and formalities, for their benefit. So first of all, they make if you have meaningful elections, not not just, very superficial elections like what you have in Syria or some Central Asian countries. They are not elections. They don't provide that much of, say, benefit for a regime. If you have some kind of, meaningful election, which can absorb participation from the opposition, it has many benefits. One important benefit, it brings you legitimacy. You have this news of Iranian election always. If it was more, heated election, you would have much more news about it. When the administration changes, again, all news, companies or media, they come to speak about elections, what's going on, or new administration, what they are going to do. So that's why Iranian image is absolutely different from Assad. Its image is different from Saudi Arabia. This is okay. They have elections, they change your policies. You have this kind of legitimacy, both internationally and nationally, domestically. And second, probably more important, benefit of election is that it kind of prevents the opposition from radicalization. Okay, so you provide some partial participation in power for the opposition, control, but at the same time, it makes them loyal to you. Okay, if you already have some chunk of power, you have some benefits of power, you have access to economic benefits and all of those rents which states provides, then it's very unlikely that you will revolt against the whole system. And that's what happened in the last few years. We had this bloody protest in the streets, but reformists mostly they didn't supported the protests because they were basically partly they were inside. So it brings it's very beneficial for the regime because it prevents the disenfranchisement and radicalization of a large part of population, which otherwise can be very, very seriously unsettling for the regime. And of course, one problem now we may have in the future is that because it's the same happening. So you are restricting elections, so you're moving all these participation. Then after that, you expect some serious damages to the system. Another probably important factor or benefit of election for the regime is that it provides the regime with some with strategies or with instruments of change. So they can justify the change by that, okay, the administration has changed and, so it's a good, controlled change mechanism. And the other one, probably, again, very important one is if you have this kind of, periodical change of administration to the opposition or to reformists and moderates, then you can shift the blame on them. We know that president can't change the fundamental policies of the system. So when we talk about president, he can't say, okay, I want to start this very fundamental policy change of foreign policy. I want to start, for example, negotiation with the US about everything. I want to change this policy. He can't do that. So many problems are basically stemmed from these fundamental policies, which are designed and implemented, set by the supreme leader and all other non-elected officers. But then elections, so you have all these problems, and then you have Rouhani. Let's say whenever something happens, okay, you shift the blame on Rouhani and all the problems. Okay, you are the, executive branch. This is not our problem. This is your problem. And that's happening right now. Everybody's blaming Rouhani instead of, going to the root, causes of the problem, which are this fundamental, foreign policy problems we have, which is set by supreme leader rather than Rouhani. So again, so it brings, tremendous rewards for the regime. And they are important, but these only happen if you have participatory elections, if you have some minimum requirements, if you're elite, come and participate in the election. If no, so it's like just very superficial. It doesn't deliver these benefits. But there is also some risks. So, because if it was all benefit, then you say, okay, well, let's have these participatory elections, all benefit. But all benefits, they come with some risks. We have risk and reward, and the risk is that the more participatory is your election, the more likely that it may turn into some white card. If you open up the electoral arena to some serious reformists which have fundamental policy changes in mind, okay, it can trigger a spiral of changes and protests and political coalitions among different parties which can easily get out of control. And then containing these these kind of unrests and political turmoils is difficult. So why the regime is restricting? Mostly because they think, okay, instead of going and trying to solve the problem after it happens, which is very costly, let's just prevent it from happening. So you remember what happened with Khatami in 1997, and after that in the 6th Iranian Majlis, in 2010, sorry, in 2000s, and then you have this very competitive election in 2008 and 2009, and this green movement, which still is a huge headache for the regime. So let's just prevent it from happening. So instead of exposing yourself to these huge risks, let's and it's very costly. So you have an election, you are going to do electoral fraud or change it, so it's much more costly, and the experience was really was successful. Remember Hashemi Rafsanjani, important figure, he was disqualified from running. There was not that much costs attached to it. It was a shock at the beginning. Then Rouhani came. Rouhani was not that much of a risk to the regime than Hashemi Rafsanjani. Rouhani won, okay, but Hashemi could be really wide risk, wide card in election. So that's why we have this kind of this balance between risk and reward. So the regime always trying to gain all of those benefits, but expose itself to less and less electoral risks. But then what happens, if you go see the trend, is that it looks like the regime is losing its risk appetite. So it allowed Khatami in 1997, then even other forces to come, and it was very beneficial for the regime. They were a force of stability. Probably if it wasn't Khatami president in 2003, maybe they would have been engaged in a war with the US, but Khatami being there, it was very important for the stability, foreign policy, everything. So you have all of these benefits, but it looks like we are losing this. The regime is losing its risk appetite through the time. It's kind of also or similar to how humans individually lose their risk appetite, by aging. So if you're young, you have lots of opportunity. You do lots of risky things. But once you reach into your 50s, say, okay, no, it's not a time. It's not a good time. You're always looking for safe zones. And what regimes do exactly is the same. Just, I don't want any of these, risky benefits. Let's just have a very safe, controlled election. And when you reach to this stage, yes, you think you are safe, but God knows this is a bad sign. This is a bad sign. This is a bad sign of of this, losing risk appetite and just going to safe zones, it seems, it looks like you feel very, very, fragile and insecure, and probably you have to wait for, turmoil and see what's happened next.